my man looking out for me. Thank you. All right, good evening. We had a little bit of the Labor Day holiday always messes with us with the class schedules. But we had a couple of Wednesdays that were kind of extra from what was originally planned. And so the lesson that I'm going to give tonight will probably look familiar to many of you because we just covered this material last fall. It was the start of a series of lessons that we did all the way through winter quarter of this year. And it was about apologetics or Christian evidences. What is apologetics? Well, it comes from the Greek word which means speaking in defense. I don't know how many of you are actually familiar with Apologetics Press, but they put together a lot of really good information. They have email lists and everything else you can get on. And a lot of this material actually has been developed by them. So if you've looked through their material, you'll probably recognize some of it from that. But speaking in defense, it's the discipline of actually defending a position, which is often religious in nature. And we defend it by the systematic use of information. Early Christian writers who defended their faith against critics and recommended their faith to outsiders were called apologists. And that's where we're getting the name now. So in the course of this evening, wanting to talk about the many faces of unbelief. And then we'll start to talk about the reasons or causes of that unbelief. So to start off with a simple question, why do so many obviously intelligent people prefer to believe that there is no God? Seems like a simple enough question. Humanity prides itself on its freedom of choice. Often when we hear those three words put in succession like that, your mind immediately goes to the abortion topic. But just the freedom of choice in what we do. Human beings are free moral agents. We've been given the right to make our own decisions. Each person decides what we're going to do on a given day, how we're going to dress, how we're going to spend our time, who we're going to spend our time with, what we're going to eat. We make all these decisions on a daily basis. But most importantly, each person decides what he or she wants to believe. A speech given by the Old Testament character Joshua allows us to see just how free each one of us is to choose if we want to believe in God. Speaking to the Jewish nation thousands of years ago, Joshua said, "If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua's point here could not be more clear. The Jews, just like every other nation and all individual people, had the freedom of choice to believe or not to believe in God. Freedom, though, always comes with responsibility. And I know that is a term that is not accepted much by today's standards. You mentioned the word responsibility, and most people run for the hills. But with freedom of choice comes the responsibility to think carefully, choose wisely, and act forcefully. Therefore, it is the responsibility of every human being to recognize, believe, and obey the truth. So what are some of the faces of unbelief? I forgot to turn this monitor on in front of me, so I can't see what this thing's showing. Throughout history, many people have decided not to believe in God. They have gone by many different names. They've gone by the term atheists, free thinkers, thank you, Sandy, agnostics, infidels, and many other names. And in this evening's study, I want to look at a few specific types. First of all, the atheists. The word atheism means without God. The atheist is the person who says there is no God. The late Carl Sagan, many of you have heard of him. He was one of the most famous atheists. He summed up atheism when he declared, "The cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be." An atheist is one who plainly states that God does not exist. It is much easier for someone to call himself an atheist than it actually is for him to defend that position. In order to know that there is no God, a person would have to know every single fact in the universe. Because the one fact that they may not know might be the fact that God exists. For instance, if a person had a unique blue striped shirt, he could not prove that no other shirt in the world was like that shirt unless he had seen every shirt that existed. The atheist cannot prove that God does not exist because he cannot possibly know every other fact there is to know, any more than that man looking for the blue striped shirt can look at every shirt that exists. The actual truth of the matter is that most atheists do not deal with facts at all. They really aren't interested in the facts. They are so set against the idea of God that they dismiss or ignore the evidence that proves his existence. The late Isaac Asimov, another famous atheist, once said, "Emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect he doesn't exist that I don't want to waste my time." Atheism does not answer the evidence for God's existence, and it cannot offer reasonable alternative for belief in him. Another type is the agnostic. The word agnostic means without knowledge. The agnostic does not boldly proclaim that there is no God. Instead, he suggests that no one can know whether or not God exists because there is simply not enough evidence upon which to base that conclusion. In essence, then, an agnosticism, that's a tough word, agnosticism says, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows, and nobody can know if there is a God. Agnostics frequently point out that man cannot know everything and that he never has been able to detect God with his limited mind and capabilities. Thus, the agnostic suggests that people should just quit searching, quit wasting their time. What an agnostic fails to realize is that that concept actually works in both directions. That is to say, a man must be unable to reach up to God, and that God must be unable to reach down to man. But God is not unable to reach men, for he is not limited by the same constraints of time and knowledge as humans. An infinite God could make himself known to us anytime he wanted, and there is nothing to prevent him from doing so. Furthermore, there is good evidence that he has done exactly that. The agnostic's claim of "I can't know," really, it's a mask that he puts on to hide the fact that he realizes that there is ample evidence that he can neither explain away nor disprove to establish the existence of God. Perhaps the agnostic cannot find God for the same reason that a lawbreaker can't find the police. Another part is the skeptic. This is one we find quite often. And this is simply the person who doubts there is a God. The Standard Dictionary definition is quite revealing when it describes a skeptic as one who holds to the doctrine that true knowledge or knowledge in a particular area is uncertain and who has doubts concerning basic religious principles. That's right out of the dictionary. We should notice that the skeptic does not claim knowledge of God is unattainable, as the agnostic does, but rather they're uncertain about it. They're skeptical about it. The skeptic is not prepared to accept anything except that which can be verified empirically, that is, using our senses, our five senses. To the skeptic, then, science becomes the only valid method of proving anything. Since God cannot be seen, tasted, heard, touched, or smelled, then skeptics say that either he does not exist or that he cannot be very important, even if he does. However, the skeptic's position is faulty because even he knows some things exist that cannot be verified by the scientific method. Science will never be able to observe or explain such concepts as love, hate, sorrow, or joy. Science will never be able to explain why a man is in a foxhole during a war and he throws himself on a hand grenade to save his fellow soldiers. The sad part is that the skeptic has paid a high price for his skepticism, and that is the rejection and abandonment of some of human race's most important and cherished concepts. But why is that? In order to say that I do not believe that God exists, or I doubt that God exists. Another face of unbelief is the infidel. We learned this term very well over the last 15, 20 years with the radical Islamists. They love to refer to anyone that does not believe in the Quran and all its teachings as the infidel. The infidel is defined as the person who not only refuses to believe in God himself, but who also is intolerant of and actively opposes anyone who does. The infidel speaks out against God and does all he can do to condemn religion. The infidel despises God and the Bible and anyone who believes in either. So, those are some of the faces of unbelief. But what are some of the causes? Well, I'm sure we could all come up with quite a few of them. But I believe there's about 6 or 8 that I want to focus on this evening. And let's go ahead and start right off. First one being, oh, that's not right. That looks familiar, doesn't it? Catch up here. Did I even bring the right slideshow? Well, we'll go back to here. Sorry about that. Okay, so first one being bias against God. There is little doubt that many people find belief in God difficult because there is in their own mind a bias that sways them against it. This built-in bias is what some have referred to as the prejudice of unbelief. One author put it like this: one of the significant and obvious reasons the unbeliever remains an unbeliever is because he likes it that way. In fact, evidence of any source or to any degree fails to remove him from his position if he is strongly bent against evidence and toward unbelief. At times, people who suffer from extreme prejudice, especially when it comes to belief in God, many people do have this extreme prejudice. I'm sure you've run into them in your life. I know I have in mine. They operate within a framework of bias against the God of the Bible. The Christian God is utterly repugnant to them because he represents a threat to man's own desires and ambitions. In other words, the will of man is on a collision course with the will of God. And such a course leads inevitably to a conflict of interests. Quite simply, some people would rather die in sin than live in obedience. Paul reminded the first century Christians in Rome, in Romans chapter 1, verse 21, "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." Verse 28, "And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind, to do those things which are not proper." In biblical usage, the term fool generally does not indicate an unintelligent person, and it certainly is not used here in that fashion. Instead, the term carries both a moral and a religious judgment, as it does in Romans 1. This is why the psalmist, again by inspiration, wrote in Psalm 14:1, "The fool has said in his heart, 'There is no God.' They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good." So, if in Psalm 111, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, then Isaiah 32:6 speaks nonsense, and his heart inclines toward wickedness. There's a opposite there. Foolishness finds its origin in the rejection of God, but yet here in Isaiah we see that a man who speaks nonsense and his heart is inclined toward wickedness. Bias against God, it's become one of the chief causes of unbelief, which no doubt explains why the writer of the book of Hebrews warned in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, "Take care, brethren, that there not be any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God." Bias against God, it's one of those that's easy to see in society. Another one is the influences of parents and upbringing. Those of you that are parents, those of you that are children, covers everyone. We all recognize that one of the biggest influences in our lives is that of our parents. Generally speaking, mothers and fathers not only are the first influences in a child's life, but also are a continuing influence. It has been said that a child's mind is like Jell-O, and that the parent's task is to put the good stuff in before it sets. The task of putting the right things into the mind of a child is difficult. No one would doubt that, and it requires a lot of patience. It's a 24-hour, full-time process that should take place continuously when sitting with the child, when riding in a car, eating a meal together, or even while watching television. As Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 7 says, "These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Sometimes the education of a child is accomplished by instruction, which is why parents are encouraged to rear their children in the training and admonition of the Lord. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Other times it's accomplished by discipline, as a proverb writer wrote when he commented in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 15, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother." On occasion, parents fail to teach their children to believe in God. Sadly, it's not on occasion. It's actually frequently. Parents fail to teach their children to believe in God. And sadly, sometimes they even teach a child not to believe in God. If children see a parent who doesn't care about God or is skeptical of all the evidence relating to God's existence, that child is likely to end up as indifferent and as skeptical as his or her parents. The spiritual condition of entire nations has been adversely affected because of the failure of parents to instruct their children properly regarding the belief in God. Following closely with that is education. Certainly one of the most important causes of unbelief is improper education. Proper education is a wonderful tool, and it can be used to build better communities, better nations. But some types of education are bad, not only for individuals, but for societies as well. Any type of education that attempts to destroy belief in a divine creator or in God is a negative system that can lead only to ruin. As sad as it is, the kind of education that is now being offered in many public schools has that potential, and in some cases actively tries to destroy faith in God. One of the main tools used to destroy such a faith is the teaching of organic evolution. For the past 25 to 30 years, evolution has been taught as scientific fact in many elementary, junior high, and high schools. And of course, it is also taught at many colleges and universities. As a result, when textbooks and teachers present organic evolution as something all reputable scientists believe, many students believe in the theory without ever being exposed to the opposing evidence, which shows that creation by God is a much better explanation of the origin of the universe. We've seen similar tactics when it comes to what's going on this week here in Anchorage or in Alaska. We've seen very similar tactics in the theory of man-made global warming. It is taught quite simply as fact in our schools. And you can't watch any newscast lately without seeing how we're beyond repair and we're going to die somehow because of all this stuff going on. Well, as many of you know, I work with the Weather Service. And as a federal employee, which in case somebody's watching, the official line I'm told to say is that we are still collecting evidence, but everything points to the fact that man is in fact causing global warming. Obviously, I don't necessarily believe that. But the point here is that it's being presented as fact because some scientists say it is happening because of what man is doing. But there are just as many or even more scientists that argue that it's not really happening, and what is happening is not caused by man. And I could go on for hours about this. If you want to talk to me about it, track me down. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. But the people that are pushing this man-made global warming, they will turn away from facts. And some of those facts are that we have introduced new technology into weather observing that actually has a documented warm bias. These new electronic thermometers. We're also taking our climate measurements from airports. What's at airports? Lots of concrete, hot concrete. This sensor down here at the Anchorage Airport, if the wind swings around to the south, it'll warm 5 degrees in a couple of minutes, just because of the asphalt that's around it. But these facts, they just get in the way of their agenda. And that's something we all have to be careful of in the education system, is understanding the motivations behind people. There is big, big money to be had by grants and everything else if you say the right things in the scientific community. And money motivates people, not necessarily truth. It's sad, but that's just the way it is. But anyway, I'll get back on topic here. And I'll probably not have a job tomorrow, but we'll see. So where was I? Let's see. I'll just go on. Another cause is immorality. Okay, many people will not believe in God because, quite simply, if they do, they're going to have to change the way they live. None of us want to change the way we live, do we? It's a free country. We should be able to live however we want, do whatever we want, with no repercussions. These people may be involved in such things as homosexuality, greed, adultery, or any number of actions that are contrary to the laws of God. So as soon as they admit that there is a God, then they must also admit that what God wants them to do or not do. And they don't want a God who tells them what to do, so they simply choose to believe that there is no God. Psalm 14:1 discusses this clearly. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. One of the most common reasons people choose not to believe in God is quite simply because they do not want to give up their sinful lifestyles. It is the epitome of selfish behavior. Scientific materialism is another cause of unbelief. We are living in an era where science rules. Whether it be junk science or real science, it rules. We observe its accomplishments every day. Science has been successful in doing some wonderful things, such as eradicating smallpox, putting men on the moon, although some will argue that never happened, preventing polio, and lengthening human lifespans. However, while we need to be grateful for these advances of science, we need to also acknowledge all that science owes to God. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God told man to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. And surely this statement by God is the cornerstone or charter of science. Yet, undoubtedly, one of the greatest obstacles in belief in God is the attitude that science somehow has made belief in God obsolete. Many scientists today claim that the only way to discover something is by empirical observation. If something cannot be observed by the five senses, then it either does not exist or is not important. Of course, since God cannot be observed by these five senses, to many scientists and others who have adopted such a view, he does not exist. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie that God isn't dead, or God's not dead, or whatever it was, something like that. It was a movie that came out last year, spring of last year. The story is about a Christian college student who's named Josh who enrolls in a philosophy class at a school. The professor in this class just happens to be an atheist who demands that his students write a declaration page that says that God is dead. The professor states that this will allow him to talk about more important philosophical topics because their class time won't be bogged down talking about a mythical God. The student, Josh, is the only student in the class who refuses to write the statement, the only one who didn't feel pressure or bow to the pressure to fill out the statement. So the professor then requires Josh to debate the topic with him, with the class members deciding who wins. The professor gives Josh 20 minutes at the end of the first 3 lecture sessions to argue that God exists. In the first 2 debates, the professor has counter-arguments for all of Josh's argument or points. During this time, Josh's girlfriend breaks up with him, fearing that standing up to the professor over something like this will jeopardize their academic future. This happening is made more interesting by the fact that Josh and his girlfriend have been together for quite some time, and they were even in the same youth group in their home church congregation. Ultimately, it comes down to the third and final debate between the professor and Josh, who again both make compelling points. Josh then halts his line of debate to pose a question to the professor. And his question was simply, why do you hate God? After Josh repeats the question twice more, the professor explodes in rage, confirming that he hates God for his mother's death that left him alone despite his prayers. Josh then casually asks the professor how he can hate someone that doesn't exist. I don't mention the movie there because I believe it was a great movie, or even because I thought it was all that accurate, but the movie actually had many issues, and it was clearly not written to follow the pattern for becoming a Christian that is given in the Bible. But I mention the movie because it illustrated what our children are being bombarded with in our public education. All across the nation, it's happening. Even in so-called Christian schools, they're getting bombarded with lies. I also mention it because it also gives a nice example of a young person not bowing down to worldly pressure and standing up for God. We need more of our young people to do that. And following closely along with that is intellectual peer pressure as another reason for unbelief. Nobody likes being labeled as stupid, dumb, ignorant, or moronic. Yet all of those labels have been applied to people who are willing to defend the existence of God and the biblical concept of creation. I work in the scientific community, and people do look at you a completely different way if you say you believe in God. It automatically brings you down a few levels in their eyes because they just think you can't be that bright if you really believe that. Thousands of highly intelligent people are scientists, and many of them believe in evolution. The idea being suggested then is that all intelligent people believe in evolution, and only the backcountry Southern hicks with no education believe in God. I've actually heard that said. After all, how could so many smart people be wrong? The idea that truth is determined by popular opinion or majority vote is false. A thing may be and often is true even when accepted only by a small minority. In fact, scientific successes have often occurred because researchers rebelled against the majority opinion for the sake of truth. Just because millions of people believe something does not make it right or true. If something is true, stating it 1,000,000 times does not make it any truer. In addition, if a statement is false, stating it 1,000,000 times does not make it any less false. And finally, another cause of unbelief is evil, pain, and suffering. The existence of evil in the world, the existence of pain in each of our lives, the existence of suffering. All of these things will make a person, or can make a person, doubt that there is a God. They'll ask the question, if there is an all-powerful God, all-powerful loving God, and if he is all good, then why do bad things happen to innocent victims, such as babies? Many have abandoned belief in God simply because of the presence of suffering in their lives or in the lives of those who are close to them. Some have lost children. Others have uttered what they believe to be unanswered prayers. And still others have seen their best friends taken from them. And faced with these terrible tragedies, they have decided that God must not exist, because if he did, then surely he would have done something to prevent such events. Here is a brief response to this problem. When God created everything, he said that it was very good. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. However, the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, sinned against God and brought pain and suffering into the world. God always has given human beings the right to make their own decisions. He did not create humans as robots that have no choice. The suffering that is present in the world today is a result of the misuse of freedom of our choice of both past generations and our current generation. Furthermore, there are times when suffering is actually beneficial. Think of a man whose chest begins to throb as he begins to have a heart attack, or the woman whose side starts to ache at the beginning of appendicitis. Pain often sends us to the doctor for prevention or cure. Also, pain and tragedy help humans develop some of the most treasured traits in our society, such as bravery, heroism, self-sacrifice, and numerous others. The fact that even Jesus, as the Son of God, was subjected to pain and suffering proves that God loves and cares for his creation. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you as an example for you to follow in his steps. God could have abandoned us to our own sinful devices, but instead, as we read in Romans chapter 5, and I don't have that there. That's weird. Okay, I guess I don't have that one. Never mind. Romans chapter 5, verse 8, but God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. All too often, man's wisdom, or perceived wisdom, has replaced God's, causing many to lose their way in what has become one of the most horrible and yet one of the most common tragedies of our day. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed Jews asked for signs and Greeks searched for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. The price that humans have paid for being intellectually learned but spiritually ignorant, it's the loss of their souls. and that price is far higher than anything they ever could have imagined. The Lord is happy today, or to help those today who have an honest unbelief. He has provided ample evidence so that they might believe. But what about those who refuse to believe in God in spite of the evidence? Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. There are many reasons. There are many causes of unbelief out there. As the body of Christ, we need to be able to recognize those things when we see them and offer evidence to help those to understand that there is a God. And that was the point of this series as we did it last year. And I do hope to get back to it maybe early next year and finish up the series. But we will talk about it more next week, next Wednesday night, and get into some of a broader overview of some of the evidence that is out there that we can use to show others that God does in fact exist. I thank you for your time. Have a good evening.